So thank you for having lunch with us today, and hello to people on Zoom land. My name is Amy Lang, and I coordinate the Immigration Court Observation Project on behalf of the Advocates for Human Rights. And I'm pleased to be joined on the panel by Chris Levesque, Sue Cook, Jeff Odendahl, and Meg Hennessy. And they will be introducing themselves after I give a little background on the project. And I have to just say, I don't usually get nervous, but I was nervous, you know, law school lawyers, and then mainly it's not lawyers here, and I know a lot of you, so thank you for that. The Immigration Court Observation Project began in 2017, shortly after the first proposed Muslim ban. And it was really an idea sparked by the outpouring of volunteer energy at the protests at the airport following the announcement of the racist ban. The project is officially a collaboration between the Advocates for Human Rights, the James H. Binger Center for New Americans at the University Law School, and the law firm of Robbins Kaplan, LLP. And it started just as a pilot, but it's continued to grow and expand for the past 5.5 years. About 800 individuals have participated as court observers since the project started, and I personally think that's an impressive and staggering number. Some people just come for a time or two. Some people do it for a semester, and some have literally been observing for the past 5.5 years. So trial monitoring is an established international practice which serves to bring transparency and accountability to judicial proceedings and uphold the right to due process and just outcomes. Trial monitoring, or what we call court observation, can shine a light on due process failures and human rights abuses, and can hold state actors to account. Court proceedings which are held out of the view of the public, simply put, are illegitimate. So the Immigration Court Observation Project fundamentally serves to uphold the principles of accountability, transparency, and due process. I'd be remiss in this setting if I didn't give credit to the late David Weisbrod, who was a professor at the law school and a global leader in international human rights law, and who did foundational work and writing on the practice of trial monitoring. So we owe a debt of gratitude to him. Before I say more, I wanted to point out that there's artist sketches behind us. As they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words, and the court sketches done by a variety of artists express the confusion, the dehumanization, the legal and procedural hurdles that immigrants face, and they illustrate the tremendous human toll of our dysfunctional and impersonal deportation machinery. And so I invite you to look at that while you listen, and we thank all the artists for gifting us their work. If it wasn't already obvious, I'd like to make the point that I am not an attorney, although sometimes novice observers mistake me for one, and that all credit is due to all the attorneys in the nonprofit community, including here at the Binger Center, who have advised and mentored me and our volunteers. But I make the point because this is largely a layperson project. So almost all of our volunteers are non-attorneys, and this is likely the source of our strength, longevity, and impact. And this panel will be talking about why that is so. So observers have no official role in court proceedings, so they bring a fresh perspective and are able to raise concerns and challenge systems in ways that people who have to function within them cannot. So again, this is one of the strengths of our project. International law defines core standards of justice, including just laws, due process, non-discrimination, and the recognition of human dignity. And observers without any training or background necessarily in human rights laws or principles identified all of these core components when asked to reflect on what a just and fair immigration system would look like. And of course, to raise up the failures. So observers have witnessed and documented many of those failures in our system, from the lack of universal representation, the inaccessibility of language support, financial barriers, overflowing dockets which don't give people adequate time in court, the scripts which don't adequately explain the process, the lack of legal pathways to status for so many people who've built lives in this country, and of course, the trauma of detention. Let me say that again, the trauma of detention. So what observers do, they sit in court, they take notes, fill out forms, looking at new procedures, they document trends, they look for the upholding of human dignity or the failure to do that, they raise issues of concern, and ultimately, the goal, though, besides bearing witness, is to work with other advocates and activists in affected communities to fundamentally build the momentum to build a more humane immigration system. So I want to say that I was here last night for the community conversation on deportation abolition, and it was very provocative because what I originally said is a system that doesn't have witnesses lacks legitimacy. But the question raised last night is, if we are there, are we adding legitimacy to something, are we complicit in making something legitimate that's illegitimate? I like to think of observers, at least because we are outsiders and not players to the system, is that we are trying to be the change makers. But I grapple with that question. I hold on to that during our panel today and welcome the conversation. So I want to bring our panelists into the conversation, and I'm going to ask them first. Well, I have some questions for them, but then I hope that we'll get some questions from the audience, including people who are watching remotely. But I'd ask each of them, and we'll just go down the line to start, to just introduce yourself and explain your connection to the project. And if this isn't your sole focus, what else you do, and why you think that court observation is of benefit. We'll start with you, Chris.
Sure. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Just let me know if I'm too quiet, because I can be sometimes. Hey everybody, my name's Chris Levesque. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology here at the U. I'm also a trained demographer and social scientist at the Minnesota Population Center, just around the corner from the law school. And my dissertation research, my overall research focuses on immigration court here in the United States, and specifically in the upper Midwest. And overall, I research how the immigration court process tends to exacerbate social inequality for non-citizens. I study clients' access to time in the system, and also ultimately their ability to stay in the United States and what stories come out in the immigration court process. So this involves focusing on the process itself, but it also thinks about what roles attorneys play as timekeepers for their clients. And my research emerged largely out of this collaboration between myself, the sociology department, and the advocates for human rights. I began observing proceedings at Fort Snelling in around 2018 with some of the people that I'm sitting next to. And I also helped survey, measure large amounts of data, both qualitative and quantitative, that look at the immigration court process and what disparities exist. Another strength that I see, in addition to what Amy had mentioned before, is that we have essentially a large repository of field notes that explain public understandings of the immigration court process and what value can be added to, quote unquote, lay understandings of immigration law. And I think the real strength here is that we have a lot of experts in this room that aren't lawyers, but also we can work together with attorneys, with social scientists, to raise important questions about the legitimacy of the immigration court system, and also what still needs to be done in order to make this process more fair and just for people that are on trial. I'm happy to talk about that more during this panel, and I just, again, want to emphasize here that it's great to see so many familiar faces here in the room, and I'm looking forward to productive conversation.
Hi, I'm Sue Cook. I am a court observer volunteer. I've been doing that for 2 years and a few months. I am a retired consultant who helped nonprofits to do strategic planning. And in addition to my court observation work, I also volunteer with Conversations with Friends. Does everybody already know what that is? Well, just in case, another thing that you can do as a volunteer as part of this system is to work with Conversations with Friends, who do weekly writing of notes with a pen pal who's in immigration detention, and also do some visits. So it's another opportunity for people who don't have legal background to get involved and try to make a change in some aspect of the system. Are we supposed to be talking about benefits of observers in the courtroom now? Okay. So benefits of observers in the courtroom, in addition to all the stuff that Amy already said about how it changes the courtroom, I think it's also been very heartening to me to hear the places where we report something that's going on over and over that we see in hearings that we think is untoward in some way, and that Amy has a communication channel back to the court administrators in a way that actually makes some things change. And we can be sitting in court and see something, and then 2 weeks later, that judge has made a 180 on that thing and is doing things in a much better way. And that will keep you going. I think the other thing that's important about having observers in the courtroom is that the legal system in this country often has kind of a curtain between people who are not involved in it and the people who are stuck in it in some way. And going through that curtain as just a regular old person and starting to see what the government that I pay for every year with my taxes is doing and where we're putting our emphasis, I think is really important for me, both to understand what I am supporting, even though I might not believe it personally, but also then to communicate with others in my social circles to make sure people understand that this is going on as another kind of force for change.
Thank you, Sue. My name is Jeff Odendahl. I'm also a court observer. I moved to the Twin Cities about 5 years ago from outstate, and in my work in outstate, I did some volunteering with groups that welcomed refugees into our small rural community. I also worked with immigrants, helping them fill out required legal forms. And when I moved here, I was looking for something similar that I could contribute to. A friend told me about the Advocates for Human Rights, and I ended up as a court observer. I think the one thing that I think of, it kind of mirrors what Sue mentioned about this veil between the public and our court systems. I think it's true on some level with all of our court systems, but I think it's particularly true with the immigration courts. If we weren't there, the only ones who would be there would be the respondents and maybe people who knew them, but often no one else is there at all. And so I think this is a way that I can individually contribute. By myself, I'm just a small cog, but as a group I'm amazed at 800 observers over the years of the project, that all of us together provide the material, that provide reports that the public can find out about what's actually happening in our immigration courts. I also think that being there has given me the impetus to be a better advocate, both with people that I know in the community and with my representatives at the state, local, and federal level. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Meg Hennessy. I'm an assistant supervising attorney at Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, and I focus on our deportation work representing individuals who are detained. And in terms of the benefit that I see of having lay observers, Amy kind of touched on this a little bit, but as an attorney, even though I'm representing respondents and I definitely have a pro-immigrant bias and don't believe the system is just, I do sometimes feel that I am part of that system. And so I think it's very beneficial to have lay observers who are not part of that and can see things with fresh eyes and can really point out something that for me might seem business as usual, but to them is horrific in some cases. And I think it's really beneficial to have the observers to see that and to bear witness to that.
Thank you. Sue and Jeff, I'm going to turn back to you as observers. And Sue, you alerted to this a little, but I want to hear sort of what keeps you going. And maybe part of that is where do you see you've had impact, or what is it that you do with the experience? So maybe we'll start with you, Sue, and then Jeff, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I think I already touched on one thing, that actually seeing something change for the better, that keeps you going. Another thing that keeps me personally going is that, you know, my adult life has been a gradual awakening to, well, my privilege in general, but my stupidity and unawareness specifically, about many things about this country. And another thing that keeps me going back to this, even when I don't want to, is this constant rubbing my nose in what my system is and how I got here and how it's maintained. And that's just a commitment that I've made to myself, and that keeps me going, too.
I'm not really always sure whether I make a difference when I do the court observations, but I know that if I don't show up, I'm definitely not going to make a difference. I also believe that the people that we see in the immigration courts are part of my community, just like everyone here. And they could be, you know, my child, my grandchild, they could be a sibling, in some cases even a parent, although that would be pretty difficult for me to have a parent. It is having a mental block here. I'll just leave it at that.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
I realize one more thing that keeps me going is, it's amazing, we don't talk to anybody about while we're there, right? We come in, we're quiet, we watch, we listen, we write like little mice, and then we leave. But it is amazing the level of human connection that you can have with people in the courtroom with no speaking at all. And detainees, judges, attorneys, if you're willing to sit there and look people in the eye, or smile at them as you're walking through the entryway, or show somebody where the bathroom is, you know, the kinds of things that we are allowed to do, you can really like make a human connection with people at a time that they're under incredible stress. Just smiling at their little kid who is screaming on the floor, you know, and kind of disrupting things, can make a difference. And I don't know how many charged environments there are like that we get to be in every day. So that's another thing that can keep you going.
So Chris, you mentioned in your introduction that you did some work with court observation data. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. And what you didn't mention is that you interviewed several years ago a lot of observers. If you'd talk about that, what came of it, what you learned, or how it impacted, you know, your work on your PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. So the court observation project opened up a lot of avenues to think about how we can build on scholarship that's talked about the value of attorney representation, judicial discretion in the immigration court process. It's also allowed us to engage historians, social scientists, and other legal scholars work on topics related to due process in the immigration court system. We've published a handful of papers that have used the immigration court data that really center around this idea of crimmigration and sociology of narratives, and what narratives are told in court and how they often conform to ideas based on perceived threat, deservingness, or their statuses or non-citizen status as impossible subjects, to use language from BCNA. And it's really linking together the study of migration with this study of sociology and punishment. So, third-party observations have helped us think about ideas of threat, deservingness, exclusion, and how those become more normalized in our immigration system. And we also rely on these court observations to think about how, what structural vulnerabilities detainees and non-detained folks experience before, during, and after their migration to the United States. So here we're centering non-legal perspectives while also engaging collaborations with the Binger Center here and also the Advocates for Human Rights. And yeah, you mentioned the interviews. You know, an important learning moment for me was interviewing close to 60 court observers. I think this was back in 2019 before COVID. But they all had different yet somewhat similar motivations for why they wanted to participate in this project. They all really wanted to see our analyses come into fruition after these interviews came into place. And you know, in these conversations, it was clear that volunteers have different interpretations about whether or not judges or attorneys in immigration court are quote-unquote fair or just. But most overall doubted that the institution of immigration court itself promotes unbiased outcomes, and that those outcomes refute any sense of justice. So that propelled us into thinking about, you know, that third-party public observations can help promote legitimacy and holding courts accountable, but it's also highlighting to many of us how the institution of immigration law itself is a broken system to begin with, and that larger structural reforms are needed in order to transform the immigration court process. So from those interviews and then from the articles that we've written, it's been able to incorporate a new perspective that's coming not just from social scientists, not just from attorneys or legal practitioners. It's also coming from folks who have different understandings within this broader public of what immigration law is and how it functions.
So Meg, I'm going to circle back to you. You talked some about what you saw as the benefit of having observers in the courtroom as, you know, outsiders and a fresh perspective. Can you talk about some of the ways you've actually interacted with court observers, whether that's inside or outside the court?
Sure, yeah. So one important way is that part of the work that I do at Legal Aid is we've been part of a network of national qualified representatives. So they're attorneys who are appointed by the immigration court when somebody's found incompetent. And so one way we've interacted with the project is that Amy especially is very good at letting us know if they come across somebody who they believe may have a competency issue. And the judges themselves can identify, you know, if they see something, but often they might not be aware of it or, you know, may, I don't know, kind of ignore it in some ways. But the observers can submit what's called like a third-party notification to essentially force the court to kind of look at this particular person and kind of do a more thorough investigation into whether they think the person is incompetent or not. And that's very important because, of course, if they're found incompetent, they have the right to an attorney, whereas nobody else has the right to an immigration attorney that's appointed in immigration court. And then also, in addition to that, you know, the observers sometimes can direct us to referrals for other detained cases. And it's also very, you know, beneficial hearing about what is happening in immigration court, and some of the reports that have been provided are really helpful to us as well. And Amy and I and some other people doing detention work meet regularly and kind of talk about trends, and so that's really helpful as well.
Thanks. You mentioned reports, and I just want to say that we have a postcard. Oh, yeah, okay, so you got the postcard. So you can access our reports with information that's on the postcard. And I will say we've done reports that both look at the observer experience and their perceptions of what's happening in court. And we have most reports focus on the data and a deeper dive into what observers are saying and documenting, with a focus always on where are there barriers to people really getting justice, and where are barriers to people really understanding and having a fair shot. So hope people will take a look at those and feel free to share them. I'm going to come back to you for a second, Meg, just to, you know, I think some of the observers felt like our presence in the court makes a difference just for maybe the energy in the court, or maybe de-escalating things a little. I'm just curious if you've noticed, especially if you practiced or had hearings where there weren't observers versus when there are, if you're seeing anything different. And if you're not, that's a legitimate answer too. But we like to feel like we're changing the tone. So I'm just curious if you've seen that.
Yeah, and I don't have any data to back this up, but I think that it does change the tone. I mean, I feel like, I would say one of the judges that we had before who's no longer here, and I think had left before the project kind of started, was maybe one of the ones who was most problematic in terms of demeanor. So it's hard to say kind of that impact, but I do feel like the judges, I think, are kind of more just self-aware when the observers are there. And even hearings that I've had now, I mean, I don't know that the judges are like misbehaving or anything, but I do feel like sometimes they take more of an informal tone or demeanor when it's just me and the DHS attorney versus when observers are there. So I do feel like it does have an impact, and I also just have a sense that the judges are more cognizant of making sure that they are trying to go over explaining all of the rights that respondents have when observers are there versus maybe when they're not.
Thank you. So, Anna, I hate to keep lumping you together, but since you're the two official observers, Sue and Jeff, and this is a question I didn't tell you I was going to pose, but I'm just thinking, based on what you said, Sue, that sometimes you go and you see a change in court. I'm wondering if either of you have an example of something, even if you don't know that it was your complaint, but that we might have established as problematic at the beginning, and you're seeing something different. So if either of you have anything to share on that, if you'd go.
Well, the one that I've noticed the most is around interpretation. So before we started really attending to it, we were noticing a lot of examples where interpretation was incomplete, or more, that the interpretation wasn't really responsive. You could tell that the interpretation was not totally capturing what the respondent had just said. And that there were other problems that were getting cut off and that kind of thing. And we wrote, I know, a list of different interpretation problems that we were seeing. And one judge in particular, the week after Amy told us that she met with a person to talk about this one judge was like climbing down the throats of the attorneys, both attorneys, about, wait, stop, interpreter, please proceed. Da, 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 da. And if you forgot, and because you understood what the person had just said, and you tried to respond before the interpretation for that little sliver, it was a serious smackdown afterwards. So that was one where it was just incredibly obvious, that was happening.
I don't have anything specific, but I do have a general feeling that the judges are more aware of my presence in the courtroom now, and a few times have even made reference to me as an observer in the courtroom. So I definitely think there's been a change, but at least it appears to me that there is.
Thank you.
I have another one from the notes yesterday. So we're working on another report on merits hearings that we're just now starting to go through all the notes from all these hearings. And there's a note in there by an observer, not me, that says the problem is the appropriate language. They've given the respondent one language, but there's really, that person doesn't use that as their best language and has been explicit with the court that they don't understand the language they're being given very well. And so there's this, in the note, this observer describes that the judge is talking to the DHS attorney and the clerk and saying, should we, what do you think about that we should proceed or not? And the clerk, or one of them, I couldn't remember, says, yeah, we can go ahead and do it. He's clearly understanding, And then he looks back at her and he says, there's an observer here. And she wrote that in the notes. I was like, whoa, I put this one in the report. So so that was another example of where obviously that should not have been caught by the observer and written down, but it was. So there you go.
Thanks. What Sue didn't say when she did her introduction is that she has really taken on some of the really deep data analysis and helping steer the shape of a report. And God bless her. Chris, I want to go back to, you talked some about collaborations, and I know that when the Binger Center was formed, forming collaborations within the university and outside the university are fundamental to its mission. So I just want to hear a little bit more about how that collaboration has been for you and why you thought it was important.
Yeah, I mean, these collaborations are important. I think because sociologists, we're at the field that I'm in, we still have plenty to learn about, specifically from advocates and volunteers, how the public understands legal institutions and what needs to fundamentally change in order to secure legal protections for non-citizens in this country. So, before grad school, I was working as an immigration paralegal at a law firm in New York, and, I just like to think about how back then, there was always a stack of 50 to 60 employment-related petitions sitting on my desk. And, some files were smaller. I had just started working on them the other day. Others were about 3 phone books thick, and they had been pending for 5, 10, 20 years. And, and still no green card had been approved, no asylum had been granted. They had to keep reapplying for employment reauthorization every 3 to 6 years, and in the interim, their lives remained in limbo. And working at this law firm helped me begin to connect the dots between bureaucratic delay and social inequality. And then with the advocates here, I went to immigration court for the first time, and that connection between delay and inequality was magnified hundredfold for me. That was here in Minnesota, right by Fort Snelling, where you're a stone's throw away from the airport and the Little League baseball fields. And I kept going back as part of this collaboration, and it was in this environment where exclusion, arbitrary processes, and an outright withholding of certain people's rights as a result of their so-called illegality became crystal clear. And all the markers of a criminal proceeding were there, orange jumpsuits, shackles at the ankles, headphones for translation services, which attorneys would then have to take off for their clients. But these were not criminal proceedings. These were immigration hearings to deport someone. And so this is where the benefit, I think, of having third-party observers in the room truly stands out, and where academics still have a lot to learn from, which is to bear witness and to advocate for a just and humane system that doesn't deport people, but instead incorporates them into the fabric of society. So there's a growing amount of academic research that has been doing this in the past decade, specific to immigration court, but I think we still need more collaboration here, specifically with organizations like the advocates, to push for goals that we're all aligned with and to see those goals through to the finish line.
So I said in my opening remarks that ultimately we want to remake our immigration system. So, I originally said I was going to address this to Sue and Jeff, but I really want to address this to anybody. Where do you see court observers having broader impact policy-wise? Where do you see the potential? Where do you wish we would focus? Where do you think we have done that? So not that only court observers could have an advocacy role, but just if you'd want to comment on how court observation might facilitate that, or.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think first off, community-based research that involves court observation and sort of lay understandings of the law can be useful for understanding what stories get told in court, and also how the process often shuts out certain stories from being told. It often lumps people into certain categories or boxes, and I think for policymakers, it's important that they know that the process isn't working and that something has to fundamentally change for people to actually tell stories that relate to their own experiences and doesn't lump them into being labeled as a criminal or as deserving or non-deserving or as a threat. So it contributes to this idea that public perceptions of fairness lead to promoting legitimacy, sure, but it's also really about holding courts accountable. And it's also revealing what's fundamentally at issue with the law itself, which is this idea that certain people belong and certain people don't. So, if I were a policymaker and I had a report on my desk, I would want to see not just what attorneys are saying, obviously, which is important, that expertise matters, but it's also, I think, where pressure really needs to be applied is coming from the public. And, certain members of the public have access to immigration court observation, whereas some don't. And I think it's important that we incorporate more people moving forward so that they know that this process needs to change. I think I'll leave it at that, but I think I also want to just vouch again for all the work that the advocates have been doing, the reports that I've helped out with, but even beyond that, there's been a lot of valuable information that has come out of this project that needs to land on policymakers' desks.
I'd just like to add on to what you're talking about, Chris, because I think as a community member in the courts, I don't always know everything about the legal rules, but I have a pretty good idea of what feels fair and just to me. And it may not always conform to what's required by the law. And so I think that is a major, part of my responsibility in the courtroom. And the issue of whether or not somebody has an attorney, I think of it this way: the judge always says you have the right to an attorney, but not at government expense. And I think, well, I can imagine taking my 3-year-old grandson into a candy store and saying, you have a right to a candy bar, but not at my expense. And it's maybe kind of a silly analogy, but in a way it works, because the understanding that many of the individuals in the immigration court have is similar to my 3-year-old grandson's understanding of where I'm coming from. So there's the language barrier, there's a financial barrier, there's the vulnerability barrier, and the other issue that I'd like to just mention is the fact that people who are incarcerated are not free to engage very successfully in their own defense. There's so many things that they can't do. They can't make it's harder for them to make phone calls. They don't have the money to prepare documents. They don't have the ability often to prepare the documents that are required.
So I thought of a few things. One is, obviously we create data, and that can be shown to policymakers and maybe move somebody off a little dime, a little bit to the nickel next door, or something like that at least. We have our own social circles that we try to influence, and I do a lot of ranting to my friends at parties, and I hope that helps. And our religious organizations, I try to get this on the topic of, what they're thinking about and that kind of thing. And then, as Jeff mentioned before, we can write our representatives too, and I think people that do these jobs tend to do that also. Another way, I think, is that there are a lot of players in this little theater, which I understand last night was getting trashed, which is right, the system doesn't work. But there's a lot of players who have to go in there and turn themselves off and become the professional person that they need to be in that system in order to at least maybe mitigate some bad, right? And that's the judge that's got to do that, the clerk's got to do that, the guard sitting outside the door, the lady at the desk, the both attorneys. I mean, when I think about what DHS attorneys got to have going on in their heads. Anyway, there's one person in that courtroom besides the respondent who gets to have their feelings and say what they think is really going on. And that's us. And that is such a gift that, I come home and I write these incredibly angry missives to Amy, about what happened today or something that happened that I saw go on with somebody else. And I think that the more we can capture those and communicate those, I think that's another way that we can help change the system, is we got to actually retain our humanity while we're doing it. And that is not an option that is given to most of the people in the room, but is given to us. So, and then the last one is just in relationship to that, the humanness of watching another family either get this incredible thing that they've been hoping for years, or lose everything that they've worked for the last 20 years. That is a human moment. And we need to be able to figure out how to capture those human moments, and artists do it. There's good books, there's good films and everything, but the more we can capture those human moments and try to communicate those outside, I really do think that that will also have a effect long-term on the system, because frankly, change doesn't happen because some political thing happens and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, well, sure, oh, we should just change it. Yeah, that is really not very just. You're right, rational arguments do not work. But capturing the inhumanity of this and doing it in a way that it hits somebody in the stomach or in the heart, rather than you didn't do 24-2 sub B correctly, that I think might have a chance at changing this.
You guys all had such great answers. I don't know if I really have anything to add, but
So I have one, oh, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, just I don't know. I have a crazy thought that, like, if you're not in the system, that maybe you can come up with this amazing idea or this amazing way to kind of fix it. And then it's really hard when you're in it to think about, like, I can think of like specific laws or things or, that kind of thing that wants to change, but I feel like that's not what's needed. We need a complete overhaul. And so I think it's just kind of hard for somebody in it to come up with that.
So I'd like to echo that, when I think, when new observers start, often they're shocked that there's all kinds of due process things that could get fixed, like give people an attorney and let them write things in their own language, but that even if you take care of all those due process rights, our system doesn't allow for a just outcome. So the laws are written, just what you said, Jeff, that it can have a legal conclusion that is an unjust conclusion. And I think what I heard all of you saying is observers can raise that issue up with human stories in ways that it might not otherwise. So I know that this conference, or I was told that this conference in some ways is geared toward attorneys that might be taking on pro bono representation who don't practice in the field of immigration. So I'm just wondering if any of you have insights into how court observers might be of benefit to pro bono attorneys.
Yeah, I mean, I think, practically the reports that have come out, like I'm just thinking about the one about bond and how, obviously we're not looking at causation, but that people who asked for a specific amount were much more likely to get it. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but that's something very important for an attorney to know going into a bond hearing. But then on the other side, it's helpful to gather that information, to know, and then to also, support other attorneys doing the work. And then I think also just to be there to serve, as a witness and is really important.
I'll just say, I'm thinking back to the program from yesterday and the lunch that I attended, and there was a lot of talk about what attorneys can do as advocates for their clients, but also in the form of resistance lawyering. And I think, pulling from what this project has done, attorneys are, I'm sure very interested in hearing what the experts, here and others who have participated in the court observation project over the years have to say. And that goes back to, what statistics we can cite and what in-depth descriptions and field notes that observers can provide that can provide context to how specifically Fort Snelling operates, but also how the system overall functions in the national arena. And, even, offering a short description of how, a bond hearing went. What story was told in those 15 minutes? How did the judge react? Did they make eye contact with the respondent? Did the attorney give the respondent, their client, an opportunity to engage in the process? So these are types of things that we ask in the survey form, but then in my interviews with a lot of these observers, they were able to expand on this and say, well, I thought that, the individual, the judge was fair, but the system overall didn't seem very fair to me. Structurally speaking, something was off about that, and I can't really put my finger on it. And I think those are things that attorneys want to know about. I'm sure they are aware of that, being practitioners themselves, but to also recognize that this is a problem that you have to work on as a practitioner, but you also need to bring others into the conversation. I think that's a useful thing to know for attorneys and for people that have been working on this project for the past 5 or so years.
Well, I don't know what pro bono attorneys would want to know, but I would certainly welcome, questions from anyone here that would want to have ideas on what we might be able to provide.
I guess the one thing I could think of we could provide is some motivation. If you are in any way thinking that you might want to do that, there's no faster way to get points for the next life, right? It's that bad. So, if you're thinking maybe you could squeeze one in, but you're not sure it's worth it, it's worth it.
It's worth it.
So I'd love to turn to any questions we have, either from the audience here or the audience that's remote.
One back there.
Hi. Thanks so much for reporting out about what, for observing and for reporting. I'm an immigration lawyer, and I'm thinking about lots of conversations that I have with the general public and how little, echoing a lot of what you said, how everyone has an opinion about immigration, but very few people have accurate knowledge about how the laws work, how the system works. And it's so valuable to have lay people go in and have this experience and build up some knowledge about how the system works. And the comment about knowing what feels fair and just to you and then being surprised that that's not what you see happening there. And I think so often people in the general public look to justify the results of a system they don't understand by assuming, well, there must be a reason it turned out that way, or the person must have done something. And also to the points that you've made about the community's ability to advocate for change in a system once they do understand how it's working. So that's a lot of comments to lead up to. I do have a question. The question is, this is really valuable information, and there are immigration courts all over the country. And I'm wondering about getting the word out about a national expansion of this kind of project, about what the goals are for the future to help amplify the impact that you all are having. Thanks.
I'll take an inadequate crack at that question, but so we've had, and Michelle, if you want to come down and take a crack at it too. So we've had a lot of conversations with nascent projects, with projects that have gone defunct, with people that hope to start one. COVID threw a wrench into a lot, and actually EOIR, so the Executive Office of Immigration Review, in some jurisdictions used COVID as a way to shut down projects, and probably illegitimately. So in our court, we've been able to be in person the whole time. They don't want us to be remote, but things have gone remote, but there were courts that just said there can be no court observers. So I know that the advocates have been in conversation with a national firm that hopes to be able to either start pilots or plug in. So, our goal has always been to collaborate and to be a model. It hasn't happened I sort of blame COVID, but that might not be it. One thing that was mentioned last night, so I want to circle that in. And I'm guilty of this too, because I didn't do anything, my background is healthcare, I didn't do anything regarding immigration until Trump got elected. The system didn't break the day Trump got elected, but he was so racist and inflammatory, it woke a lot of people up. And unfortunately, there are people who think, oh, now there's Biden and things are fixed. They're not fixed. But so I think it's might be a little harder to get that momentum, but true change will happen when these projects are all over. And I just want to echo what you said is people don't really know how the system works. And even those of us who think that we're awake to it are just shocked. The shackles were shocking. The fact that everything has to be in English and people don't speak English and nobody helps them translate any documents. I mean, we've been told there is no line and people don't believe that, but the actual due process failures are just mind-numbing and people don't know. So thank you for the question.
Not a question in the chat, but just a comment. This is so moving and beautiful. Thank you for your work. Any other questions in the audience?
We'll start asking you questions.
I just wanted to applaud you and the work you do, because we've had a chance, as members of Conversation with Friends, to be in court and to see that, like you say, I mean, the judges and the lawyers, they know that you're there, and that makes a tremendous difference. But one of the things, I just think this is incredibly powerful presentation because it, like you mentioned a minute ago, the fact that there's lay people, immigration lawyers obviously make their living supporting immigrants. But you folks don't. I mean, you're like all of us, citizens. So how you feel about the injustice of the system is so critically important to share, as you're all mentioning. So I'm just wondering, my gosh, I'd love to see an article in the New York Times, the Washington Post, any paper to raise awareness so that the benefit of raising awareness, of course, is calling senators, calling congresspeople, calling the president, whatever. And that's what we all want to do. I'm just wondering, is that a possibility? Or would that jeopardize the program? That's all, there are repercussions if you went public in a big way.
Anybody want to answer that? Or you want? So I love to be interviewed if you know somebody at the New York Times who wants to talk to me. And if they do a Photoshop the wrinkles, I'm all for that. I mean, you raise a question about whether we could jeopardize something. I mean, one thing we're very careful about is how we present what we find. And so we try to address the system, and these kind of behaviors work and these kind of behaviors don't. These kind of barriers exist. These kind of barriers have been eradicated, whatever. We don't say Judge so-and-so was a jerk today, because that would jeopardize the program. I won't say those conversations never happen offline, but that would not be productive. So people do need to debrief, people do need to vent, but we try to be strategic in terms of who we hold to account for what, and, to recognize that, as was said on the panel, everybody in that system is constrained in some way. That's not judging their values. Some people might have good values that we agree with, and some people might not, but the system constrains people, so we're trying to address that, and that, I think, can be illuminated without any jeopardy. It's just being strategic about, and savvy to know this is where the pressure point is for this, and this is where the pressure point is for that, and I would always have Michelle be interviewed with me because she knows some of that stuff that I don't, so I think everybody knows Michelle, but I think it's a great question, and it is true that we have to raise people's stories up without sensationalizing them or exploiting them, and so one of the things we've tried to do is raise up the impact it has on observers, because they voluntarily say, I'm sharing my experience. We have to be very careful about anything that would be, regarding an immigrant in the system. But
Thank you, panel. This is near and dear to my heart. I think before this actually got officially begun, I did some work on observing in court. And because of not being able to hear the one of the attorneys who would not face us. I had to back away from that. But I have been so grateful for the reports that you have put together, because those are things that I make sure and share with my immigration team and broader than that. And I think that data is so key. We're all in this together. We've got a story to tell. You've told your story today. We tell it beyond ourselves. And I often wonder, okay, we can call our senators, and we should be calling our senators about this, but could there be something bigger that we could do together with this data to say this needs to change? And what would that be?
That's a really good question.
I mean, I can take a stab at that really quickly. So, as somebody who's in academia, I often grapple with the question of what public sociology is, how we can increase public understanding of social issues. And one way of that is to, educate folks about what the immigration court process actually is, how it's similar to the criminal court process, but also how it's somewhat different, and also where they converge. And I think that's where a lot of people, the first time observing, there's a bit of a disconnect there. They don't, maybe they were anticipating immigration court to be different from how they imagined it, but it's actually, very similar to criminal proceedings in certain ways, as I discussed earlier. So making sure that people know that and that they're exposed to those stories. Also, thinking about, in your own neighborhood, what sort of attorney access is there for clients? Looking on the AILA public website, how many attorneys are there within 100 miles of your backyard? You'd be surprised to see how little there are, especially in places like North and South Dakota, where there is a rapidly growing immigrant population, in certain parts like Sioux Falls. So in these newer immigrant destinations, it's important that the public also knows that things are changing and that the legal landscape is changing for a select group of people. So that's one way where I would begin.
I'll say one quick thing that didn't dawn on me until just now, but I think art, and that can be music, that can be visual art, that can be theater. I think about, and this isn't art, but I think about the photo of the man and his son face down, drown in was it the Rio Grande? The news cycle went away, but that was so provocative. People have to feel it emotionally, and I think art is a great way to, so if somebody can paint all these murals all over the country showing what's broken, maybe it'll wake up a few people. And art's important anyways, so support artists.
Thank you so much for your work, your volunteering, your reports, and for sharing with us over the lunch hour today. Please join me in thanking the panel.